Champagne flutes clinked, laughter echoed, and somewhere in the opulent ballroom a bride threw her bouquet. Outside in the freezing rain, shivering in a torn bridesmaid dress with a swelling jaw, Nebula dialed a number she swore she had deleted 3 years ago. The man on the other end wasn't a savior. He was a monster who owned half the city. But tonight, the monster was the only one who wouldn't ask why she was bruised. "Can you come get me?" Music pulsed through the floorboards of the country club, a steady rhythmic thrum that vibrated up through the soles of Nebula's silver heels. To anyone else in the grand ballroom, it was a night of celebration. Her younger sister Chloe was glowing in white satin, spinning on the dance floor with her new husband. The open bar flowed with top-shelf liquor. The air smelled of roasted beef, expensive perfume, and the heavy sweetness of white lilies. To Nebula, the room was a cage shrinking by the minute. She sat at the head table, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her sat Richard, her husband. To the rest of the room, Richard was a charming architect with a winning smile and a generous laugh. He had paid for the ice sculpture. He had charmed their parents. He was currently nodding along to a story being told by a drunk uncle across the table, his white teeth flashing in the warm amber lighting. Under the tablecloth, his fingers were dug into the soft meat of Nebula's thigh. He wasn't massaging her leg. His grip was a vice, his nails pressing through the thin silk of her dusty rose bridesmaid dress. It was a warning, a physical tether reminding her exactly where she belonged and what would happen if she stepped out of line. "You're quiet tonight, darling," Richard murmured, leaning in close. His breath was warm against her ear, smelling heavily of scotch and spearmint. "People are going to think you're not happy for your sister." "I'm happy," Nebula said. Her voice was flat, hollowed out. She forced the corners of her mouth upward. "Just tired, tired." He rolled the word around in his mouth like a bad piece of meat. The pressure on her thigh increased until a sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. The uncle across the table didn't notice. No one ever noticed. "You don't get to be tired, Nebula. Not when I spent $3,000 on that dress you're wearing." "Smile." She smiled. It felt like her face would crack. "I need to use the restroom," she whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the centerpiece. Richard's eyes flicked toward the exit, calculating. He slowly released his grip, smoothing the silk over her leg, in a mocking gesture of affection. 5 minutes. Don't speak to anyone on the way. You've had enough wine." Nebula hadn't taken a single sip of her wine. She stood her legs trembling slightly and navigated the maze of round tables. People waved at her. She offered them empty nods. As she pushed through the heavy mahogany doors leading to the lobby, the suffocating bass of the wedding band muffled into a dull thud. The hallway was empty, lined with vintage mirrors and floral wallpaper. She didn't go to the restroom. She needed air. She needed to breathe without smelling his cologne. Nebula walked down the corridor, passing the coat check, and pushed open a side door that led to a secluded smoking patio. The cold November air hit her like a physical blow, snapping the stagnant fog in her brain. It had started to rain, a miserable, freezing drizzle that slicked the cobblestones. She stepped under the small canvas awning, wrapping her bare arms around herself. She closed her eyes. Just 2 more hours. "I thought I said 5 minutes." Nebula's eyes snapped open. Richard stood in the doorway. The light from the hallway backlit him, casting his face in shadow. The charm was gone. The smile had evaporated. He looked at her, not like a wife, but like a dog that had chewed the furniture. "I just needed some air." Nebula said, her voice betraying her. It shook. She hated that it shook. He stepped out onto the patio, letting the heavy door click shut behind him. The click sounded deafeningly loud. Air. Or were you looking for that bartender you were making eyes at during the toast? Richard, please. He asked if I wanted water. You made me look like a fool, he hissed, crossing the small space between them in 2 long strides. Nebula backed up her spine, hitting the brick wall of the clubhouse. I didn't do anything. Don't lie to me. His hand shot out. It wasn't a slap. It was a closed fist, a short, brutal punch, aimed precisely at the side of her jaw. The impact snapped her head to the side. Her temple cracked against the brick. White light exploded behind her eyelids, followed by a rushing, ringing sound that drowned out the rain. She collapsed onto the wet cobblestones, her knees scraping against the rough ground. The metallic taste of copper flooded her mouth. She stayed on her hands and knees, staring at the puddles reflecting the dim patio lights. Her jaw throbbed with a sickening heavy heat. Richard adjusted his cuffs, looking down at her. His chest heaved once, then settled. The rage vanished, replaced by cold annoyance. Look what you made me do. You've ruined the dress. Nebula didn't move. She couldn't. I'm going back inside, Richard said, his voice returning to its normal, measured cadence. You have 10 minutes to clean yourself up in the restroom. If you aren't back at the table by the time they cut the cake, we are going home. And we both know what happens when we go home angry, don't we? He didn't wait for an answer. The door opened, releasing a brief swell of music, and clicked shut again. Nebula remained on the wet ground. The freezing rain blew sideways under the awning, soaking her hair, gluing the ruined silk to her skin. She touched her jaw. A small, involuntary whimper scraped its way up her throat. It was swelling fast. She looked at the heavy door. Beyond it was the wedding, her family, and Richard. Beyond it was the drive home, the isolated house in the suburbs, the basement stairs. If I get in that car tonight, she thought, the realization settling into her bones with a terrifying clarity, he is going to kill me. Her hands shook violently as she reached into the hidden pocket of her dress, pulling out her phone. The screen was cracked from a previous accident, but it turned on. She stared at the keypad. She didn't call the police. The police had come twice before. Richard played the concerned husband, told them she had a drinking problem, and they had left. The police required proof patience and a system. Nebula didn't have time for a system. She had 10 minutes. Her numb fingers punched in a number. 10 digits. She hadn't dialed it in 3 years, but her muscle memory knew it better than her own social security number. It was a number she had sworn to forget the day she walked away from a life she decided was too dark, too dangerous to marry a safe, respectable architect. She pressed send, pressed the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice. Pick up. Please pick up. Miles away in a windowless room beneath a high-end restaurant in the financial district, Gilbert Mercer sat at a steel table. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Gilbert leaned back in his leather chair, watching the man kneeling on the tarp in front of him. Gilbert didn't look like a mob boss from the movies. He didn't wear pinstripes or heavy gold rings. He wore a simple, immaculately tailored black suit. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and his pale eyes held the calm, detached intelligence of a predator observing a wounded animal. "I'll have it by Tuesday." The kneeling man babbled, sweat pouring down his bruised face. "Gilbert, I swear to God, Tuesday." Gilbert sighed softly. He picked up a silver lighter from the table, turning it over in his large hands. "You swore to God last Tuesday, Marcus. The problem with making promises to God in my basement is that God doesn't collect my debts. I do." He nodded to the heavy-set man standing in the corner. The man stepped forward, pulling a heavy wrench from his coat. Before the heavy-set man could swing, Gilbert's phone vibrated against the steel table. Gilbert frowned. Very few people had this number. His lieutenants, his mother, and... He looked at the screen. It was an unsaved number, but he recognized the digits instantly. A ghost from 3 years ago. The air in the room seemed to suddenly freeze. Gilbert held up a hand. The heavy-set man lowered the wrench, stepping back into the shadows. Gilbert picked up the phone and pressed it to his ear. He didn't say hello. He just listened. For a long moment there was nothing but static and the ragged, shuddering sound of someone trying to breathe. Then a voice, small, cracked, and trembling. "Can you come get me?" Gilbert's grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing creaked. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't ask why she was calling after 3 years of dead silence. He heard the wet, dragging sound of her breathing, the unmistakable slur of a swollen jaw. His eyes, usually empty and calm, darkened into something terrifying. The kneeling man on the tarp shrank back, suddenly realizing that whatever was happening on that phone call was infinitely more dangerous than his unpaid debt. "Where are you, Nebula?" Gilbert asked. His voice was a low rumble, perfectly level, devoid of any panic. Oak Ridge Country Club," Nebula whispered. "I'm outside, by the patio." "Are you alone?" "Right now, yes." "Stay in the shadows," Gilbert instructed, standing up from his chair. He tossed the silver lighter onto the table. "Do not go back inside. If anyone comes out, you run. I am leaving now." "He said 10 minutes, Gilbert. He said—" Her voice broke, a pathetic, broken sound that made a muscle tick violently in Gilbert's jaw. "I'm so cold. Look at the street," Gilbert said, walking toward the heavy metal door of the basement. "Keep your eyes on the road. I'll be the headlights." He hung up. He didn't put the phone in his pocket. He crushed it in his grip for a second, mastering the sudden, violent surge of adrenaline in his blood. He turned to the men in the room. "Clean this up," Gilbert said, pointing to the man on the tarp. "Put him in the alley. Tell him his debt is forgiven." The heavy-set man blinked, confused. "Forgiven, boss." "I don't have time to kill him tonight," Gilbert said, pushing open the heavy door. "I have somewhere to be." Back at the country club, the rain had turned into a steady, freezing downpour. Nebula crouched behind a decorative stone planter at the edge of the patio, hidden from the glass doors. Her dress was ruined, soaked through and heavy with mud. The cold had seeped past her skin, settling deep into her organs, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She checked her cracked phone screen. 7 minutes had passed since Richard left. The music inside shifted to something slow and romantic. She imagined her sister dancing. She imagined Richard standing by the bathroom doors, checking his watch, his eyes narrowing as the seconds ticked by. "He's going to come looking for me." Panic, raw and blinding, clawed at her throat. She peered around the edge of the stone planter. The driveway leading up to the country club was empty, slick with rain under the amber streetlights. 8 minutes. She heard the heavy click of the patio door opening. Nebula shoved her fist into her mouth to muffle a gasp, pressing her back flat against the freezing brick wall behind the planter. "Nebula." Richard's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the sound of the rain like a razor. It was the voice he used when the doors were locked and the curtains were drawn. "Nebula, I checked the restroom. You aren't there." Footsteps crunched slowly on the wet gravel. He was walking towards the edge of the patio. "You're making a scene, darling. You know how much I hate scenes." She squeezed her eyes shut. Her heart battered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "If you make me come out there and find you in the mud, it's going to be so much worse for you." Richard sing-songed his leather shoes, stepping off the pavement and onto the grass. He was getting closer. "Come out now, and I'll only lock you in the guest room tonight. Make me search, I'll break the other side of your face." He was feet away. Nebula could hear the rustle of his expensive suit jacket. She prepared to run, shifting her weight onto the balls of her feet, even though she knew she wouldn't make it to the street in heels. Then light flooded the driveway. Blinding, piercing white LED headlights cut through the torrential rain, throwing long, harsh shadows across the grass. Richard stopped, raising a hand to shield his eyes from the glare. It wasn't one car. It was three. Massive black SUVs moving in perfect predatory unison. They didn't slow down to park. They tore up the manicured gravel driveway, the lead vehicle swerving aggressively and slamming on its brakes just inches from the patio steps. Richard stepped back, his face twisting in aristocratic outrage. "Hey, you can't park here. This is a private event." The doors of the SUVs opened simultaneously. The men who stepped out of the vehicles didn't look like valets. They wore dark suits that hung heavy on large frames, their faces shadowed by umbrellas they snapped open in the downpour. They moved with silent, practiced efficiency, fanning out to form a perimeter around the lead car. Richard's anger faltered, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his handsome features. "What the hell is this?" The rear door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out into the rain. He didn't take an umbrella from the guard who offered it. Gilbert Mercer walked up the patio steps. He moved with the lazy, terrifying grace of a king surveying a battlefield. The rain slicked his dark hair to his forehead, soaking the shoulders of his tailored suit, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes bypassed Richard entirely, sweeping the shadows of the patio. "Nebula," Gilbert called out. His voice wasn't a yell, it was a deep, resonant anchor. Behind the planter, Nebula let out a sob she couldn't contain. She scrambled up her freezing, mud-caked legs, giving out for a second before she caught herself on the stone edge. Gilbert saw her. The absolute stillness in his demeanor fractured. He crossed the patio in 3 strides, ignoring Richard entirely, and dropped to one knee right in the mud before her. He didn't reach out to grab her. He knew better. He kept his hands visible, hovering just inches from her shivering arms. "I'm here," Gilbert said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper meant only for her. His pale eyes scanned her face, lingering on the ruined silk of her dress, the mud on her knees, and finally the dark, angry swelling on her jaw. A muscle feathered at the corner of Gilbert's eye. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You came." Nebula choked out her teeth, chattering so hard she bit her tongue. "Of course I came," he said softly. He shrugged off his heavy wool overcoat and draped it gently over her shaking shoulders. It smelled of rain, expensive tobacco, and a safety she hadn't felt in 36 months. "Can you walk?" Nebula nodded numbly, gripping the lapels of his coat. "Excuse me," Richard barked, stepping forward, his chest puffed out. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the indignity of being ignored. "Who the hell do you think you are? That is my wife." Gilbert stood slowly. He didn't turn around immediately. He kept his body positioned between Nebula and Richard, a human shield of solid muscle and tailored wool. When Gilbert finally turned, his face was a mask of terrifying indifference. He looked at Richard the way a man might look at a cockroach before stepping on it. "Your wife." Gilbert repeated the words, tasting like poison in his mouth. "Yes, my wife," Richard said, taking another step forward, trying to leverage his height. He pointed a finger at Nebula. "Nebula, get over here right now. I don't know who this thug is, but you are embarrassing me." Gilbert didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike a fighting stance. He simply took one step toward Richard. 2 of the massive men by the SUVs reached inside their jackets. The metallic click of safeties being disengaged was audible over the rain. Richard froze. His eyes darted to the guards, then back to Gilbert, the color rapidly draining from his face as the reality of the situation finally penetrated his arrogant skull. "You hit her," Gilbert stated. It wasn't a question. "She fell," Richard stammered, taking a quick step backward. The architect charm was crumbling, revealing the coward underneath. She was drunk. She slipped on the wet stones." "She slipped," Gilbert echoed softly. He tilted his head. Did you know, Richard, that human bone requires roughly 4,000 newtons of force to fracture? I'm looking at her jaw, and I see a contusion that implies a localized blunt force impact. Not a fall. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Who are you? I'm the consequence, Gilbert said quietly. He closed the distance between them in a blink. Gilbert's hand shot out, wrapping around Richard's throat with blinding speed. He drove the architect backward, slamming him against the brick wall of the country club. The impact knocked the breath from Richard's lungs in a wheeze. Gilbert didn't squeeze to kill. He squeezed just enough to hold the man pinned, his thumb pressing into the carotid artery. "Look at me," Gilbert whispered, leaning in so close that Richard could see the dead black promise in his pale eyes. "Look at me and understand what is happening right now." Richard gagged, clawing frantically at Gilbert's wrist, but the mob boss's arm was like cast iron. "You are going to go back inside," Gilbert said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "You are going to sit at your table. You will smile. You will eat your cake. If anyone asks where your wife went, you will tell them she felt ill and took a cab home. You will never attempt to contact her again. You will not call her phone. You will not drive by her new location. If I hear that you so much as looked at a photograph of her—" Gilbert leaned in a fraction of an inch closer. "I won't kill you, Richard. Killing you takes 3 seconds. I will take you to a room where time stops. I will take away your hands, your teeth, and your charming fucking smile, and I will keep you alive long enough to regret the day you were born. Blink, if you understand me." Richard's tears of sheer terror mixing with the rain on his face blinked rapidly. Gilbert released him. Richard collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping greedily for air, clutching his bruised throat. Gilbert didn't look at him again. He turned back to Nebula, the cold violence instantly melting from his posture. He approached her, offering a hand. "Let's go home, Nebula," he said gently. Nebula looked at the man gasping on the grass, the man she had feared for 3 years, reduced to nothing in 30 seconds. Then she looked at Gilbert. She took his hand. It was warm. Gilbert led her down the steps, pulling open the door of the warm SUV. Once she was safely inside, he closed the door, blocking out the cold, the rain, and her past. The heavy door of the SUV slammed shut, sealing them inside. The chaotic percussion of the freezing rain was instantly severed, reduced to a muffled patter against armored glass. Nebula sank into the plush leather seat, her trembling fingers gripping the lapels of Gilbert's wool coat. She pulled it tighter around her ruined dress, anchoring herself to the smell of tobacco and cedar. Gilbert sat beside her. He didn't crowd her space. He maintained a careful, deliberate distance, turning his attention to a small compartment built into the center console. The vehicle pulled away from the country club. Nebula watched the amber streetlights bleed past the tinted windows. She waited for the adrenaline to crash. She expected to feel a crushing wave of guilt or the terrifying realization of what she had just done. She had left her husband. She had abandoned her sister's wedding. She had summoned a man the FBI had been trying to build a RICO case against for a decade. Instead, all she felt was the agonizing throb in her jaw. Gilbert pulled a small silver first aid kit from the compartment. He unzipped it with quiet efficiency, pulling out a chemical ice pack. He squeezed it in the center. The sharp crack echoed in the quiet cabin, followed by the hiss of the cooling chemical reaction. He didn't hand it to her right away. He turned toward her, his large frame shifting the leather seat. "May I?" he asked. His voice was a low, steady rumble. It was the same tone he used to negotiate shipping routes or threaten politicians, but stripped of its usual venom. Nebula nodded once. Gilbert leaned in. His hands were large knuckles, scarred from a lifetime of enforcing his own rules, but his touch was impossibly light. He brushed a wet strand of hair away from her temple, his thumb hovering just millimeters from her bruised skin. The heat radiating from his hand was a stark contrast to the freezing ice pack he gently pressed against her swelling jaw. Nebula hissed a sharp intake of breath as the cold bit into the inflamed tissue. "Keep it there," Gilbert instructed gently, guiding her hand to hold the pack. 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off. It will stop the swelling." Nebula held the pack, leaning her head back against the headrest. She stared at him. Under the dim, ambient lighting of the car's interior, Gilbert looked exactly as he had 3 years ago. The sharp, predatory angles of his jaw, the cold, assessing, pale eyes, the immaculate tailoring that hid a body built for violence. "You didn't ask what happened," she said. Her voice sounded muffled, distorted by the ice and the pain. Gilbert reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to her. "I don't need to ask what happened. I saw your face. I saw the way he looked at you. The details are just background noise." Nebula took the flask. The dark liquor burned a trail down her throat, settling as a warm, heavy weight in her stomach. It helped stop the shivering. "He told everyone I had a drinking problem. That's why I bruised so easily. That's why I was always clumsy." Gilbert's eyes darkened, the irises swallowing the pale light. He looked out the front windshield, his jaw tight. "A coward's tactic. Isolate the asset. Discredit the witness. It's textbook. I wanted a normal life." Nebula whispered the confession, tasting bitter in her mouth. She stared down at her muddy knees. "When I left you, Gilbert, I told you I couldn't handle the paranoia, the guards, the secrets. I wanted a house with a lawn, a husband who went to an office, a safe, boring life." A heavy silence stretched between them, accompanied only by the hum of the engine and the splash of tires on wet asphalt. "You found a monster hiding in a tailored suit, Nebula," Gilbert said, softly looking back at her. "The world is full of them. The only difference is that my monsters wear their scars on the outside. We don't pretend to be saints." Nebula closed her eyes. The truth of his words ached more than her face. She had traded a man who fought the world to protect her for a man who used her as a punching bag behind closed doors. She had confused legality with morality. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Home," Gilbert replied. "My apartment?" "You don't have an apartment anymore." Gilbert interrupted his tone, leaving no room for argument. "You don't have a car. You don't have a joint bank account. Richard Trent is a ghost to you now. You are going to my house. The gates are 12 feet high, the glass is ballistic, and there are 6 armed men patrolling the perimeter. You are going to sleep, and tomorrow we will figure out the rest." He didn't phrase it as a question. It was a command. For the first time in years, Nebula didn't feel the urge to rebel against an order. She leaned deeper into the seat, the ice pack numbing her skin, and let the darkness of Gilbert's world swallow her whole. Sunlight was a harsh, unforgiving intruder. It spilled across the enormous mattress, warming the heavy grey duvet that covered Nebula. She lay perfectly still, tracing the geometric shadows on the ceiling. For 3 years, waking up required a mental checklist. Check Richard's mood. Check the placement of his shoes. Determine the threat level before speaking. This morning, the only sound was the distant, muffled hum of city traffic, 30 stories below. She pushed herself up, ignoring the stiff ache in her muscles. The bedroom was massive, decorated in Spartan tones of charcoal slate and dark wood. It lacked personal touches, looking more like a high-end hotel suite than a home. Nebula swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She was wearing an oversized black t-shirt she had found folded at the edge of the mattress last night. It smelled faintly of Gilbert's cologne. She walked into the attached bathroom and stood before the sprawling vanity mirror. The harsh LED lighting offered no mercy. The right side of her jaw was a mottled, horrifying canvas of deep violet, sickly yellow, and angry red. The skin was tight and swollen, warping the symmetry of her face. There was a small cut near her temple, where she had hit the brick wall. She stared at the reflection tracing the edge of the bruise with a trembling fingertip. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up somewhere around year 2 of her marriage. What she felt now was a cold, hollow exhaustion. She washed her face carefully, wincing as the water hit her jaw, and walked out into the penthouse. The living space was an open concept expanse of glass and steel, offering a penebulamic view of the city skyline. Gilbert sat at a massive oak dining table that served as a makeshift desk. He was dressed simply in dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dark ink of a sprawling tattoo on his left arm. Several open laptops and stacks of manila folders surrounded him. He didn't look like a man who had pulled a gun on an architect a few hours prior. He looked like a tired executive. "There's coffee in the kitchen?" Gilbert said without looking up from a document. "And eggs on the stove. Eat?" Nebula walked into the kitchen. A plate was waiting on the marble island, kept warm under a glass dome. She poured a mug of black coffee and carried it back to the living area, taking a seat at the opposite end of the long oak table. Gilbert finally looked up. His eyes tracked the violent colors on her face. A subtle tightening of his mouth was the only physical reaction he allowed himself, but the atmosphere in the room shifted, growing heavier. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Only when I breathe," Nebula replied dryly. Gilbert closed the folder in front of him. He pushed it aside, leaning his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. "My lawyer has already filed the restraining order on your behalf. We have a team boxing up your personal belongings from the house in the suburbs. Richard is currently at work. He will return to an empty house. The locks have been changed, and the deed is being transferred." Nebula stopped with her coffee mug halfway to her mouth. "You can't just take his house. I can—" Gilbert corrected flatly. "I hold the mortgage through a shell company he wasn't smart enough to investigate when he took out the loan. He missed a clause. He's in default." Gilbert: "He's lucky I only took the house, Nebula. He's breathing because you asked me to come get you, not because I have a sudden respect for the sanctity of human life." He stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked out over the city, a sprawling grid of millions of people, yet he seemed entirely isolated. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" Gilbert asked. The question hung in the air, stripped of anger, heavy with an exhaustion that matched her own. Nebula wrapped both hands around her warm mug. "Because calling you meant admitting I was wrong. I left you because I thought your world was toxic. I thought the violence would eventually consume me. I stood in this exact room 3 years ago and told you that you were a criminal, and I couldn't build a family with a man who had blood on his hands." Gilbert didn't turn around. His broad shoulders remained perfectly still against the backdrop of the grey city sky. "I wanted to prove that I could find a good man," Nebula continued, her voice cracking. "A man who went to charity galas, a man who built hospitals. I wanted the illusion so badly that I ignored the red flags. I ignored the way he gripped my arm. I ignored the way he spoke to waiters. By the time he hit me the first time, we were already married, and I was so ashamed of failing that I just stayed." Gilbert turned around. He crossed the room, slowly pulling out the chair next to hers and sitting down. He didn't reach for her. He just sat close enough that she could feel the steady, radiating heat of his presence. "You didn't fail, Nebula. You survived," Gilbert said, his pale eyes locking onto hers. "You survived a predator who hid in plain sight. You survived long enough to make the call. That isn't failure." "I feel broken," she whispered, looking down at her coffee. "You're bruised," he corrected gently. "Bruises heal. Bone knits back together. The rest of it, the fear. We will burn that out of you. You are going to stay here as long as you need. You are going to eat. You are going to sleep. And you are going to let me handle the monsters." Nebula looked at him, searching his face for the catch, for the expectation of a debt owed. but there was only the quiet, terrifying devotion that had scared her away in the first place. "Why are you doing this, Gilbert, after everything I said to you?" Gilbert offered a faint, humorless smile. "Because 3 years ago you walked out that door and I let you go because I thought you were right. I thought you deserved a safer world than the one I could provide. But if the safe world is going to treat you like this—" His smile vanished, replaced by cold, absolute certainty. "Then I'm taking you back, and I dare God himself to try and stop me." 4 days blurred into a quiet, structured isolation. The violent purple on Nebula's jaw oxidized into a sickly, mottled yellow that spread down her neck. She lived in the oversized t-shirts and soft cashmere sweats Gilbert had sourced, moving through the massive penthouse like a ghost haunting a glass castle. Gilbert was always there, yet entirely unobtrusive. He didn't hover. He didn't ask her probing questions about her trauma. He simply existed in the periphery, working from the long oak table, speaking in low, clipped tones into a secure phone. He dismantled Richard Trent's life with the same detached efficiency an accountant uses to balance a ledger. Nebula watched him from the kitchen island, nursing her 3rd cup of tea. He was authorizing the liquidation of Richard's firm's primary supplier. It was highly illegal. It was extortion. She felt absolutely no guilt. That was the terrifying part. 3 years ago, the casual cruelty of Gilbert's world had made her stomach turn. Now it felt like justice. She realized with a bitter clarity that the moral high ground was a luxury for people who had never been beaten in their own home. Gilbert ended his call and set the phone face down. He looked up, catching her stare. "You're quiet," he noted, leaning back in his chair. "I was just thinking about the difference between you and him." Nebula said, her voice raspy. The swelling in her jaw had gone down, making it easier to speak, but the psychological knot in her throat remained. Gilbert's expression remained unreadable. "And what is the difference?" "Richard hurt me because it made him feel big," Nebula said, tracing the rim of her ceramic mug. "He controlled what I wore, who I spoke to, how much I drank. It was petty. It was about making me small." She looked up, meeting his pale eyes. "You control cities. You break laws. But you never tried to break me." Gilbert held her gaze for a long moment. He didn't offer a gentle platitude. He didn't deny his nature. "I destroy things that stand in my way, Nebula. I am not a good man, but you were never in my way. You were the only thing I wanted to build." He stood, walking over to the kitchen island, and placed a sleek new smartphone on the marble counter next to her tea. "Your old phone is at the bottom of the river," Gilbert said. "This one is encrypted. My number is on speed dial 1. The security desk downstairs is 2. Nebula looked at the black screen. "Who else has this number?" "Only the people you choose to give it to," Gilbert replied. "But I took the liberty of calling your sister this morning. She is expecting a call from you. Whenever you are ready." Nebula's stomach clenched. Chloe. The wedding she had ruined. The family she had abandoned in the dead of night. Richard would have spun a narrative by now. He was a master architect of lies, building facades to hide his rot. "What did he tell them?" She asked, her hands shaking slightly. "He told your parents that you had a mental breakdown," Gilbert said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He claimed you relapsed into a severe depressive episode, ran off with a dangerous man you met at a bar, and that he is frantically working with private investigators to find you and get you into a psychiatric facility." A cold sweat broke out over Nebula's ribs. It was brilliant. It painted Richard as the tragic, devoted husband and Nebula as the unstable wife. If she went to the police now, her family would corroborate Richard's story. "She's unwell. She makes things up. They believe him," Nebula whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. "It doesn't matter what they believe," Gilbert said, His hand hovered over hers on the counter, close enough to share warmth, but not touching. He never touched her without permission. It matters what you can prove. Call her. Nebula picked up the phone. She carried it out to the balcony, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind her. The cold city wind whipped her hair across her face, biting into her cheeks. She dialed her sister's number. Chloe answered on the first ring. Hello. Chloe, it's me. Nebula. Chloe's voice cracked, thick with exhaustion and panic. Oh my God, Nebula, where are you? Richard is out of his mind with worry. Mom has been crying for 3 days. You ruined the wedding, you just vanished. I didn't vanish, Nebula said. Her voice was remarkably steady. The wind swallowed her hesitation. I escaped. Escaped? What are you talking about? Nebula, Richard told us you were having an episode. He said you were drinking again and acting erratic. Please just come home. He wants to help you. Chloe, listen to me. Nebula snapped the sudden authority in her tone, silencing her younger sister. I am not crazy. I am not drinking. Richard is a liar. He is dangerous. He loves you. He's been at our house every night looking at maps, hiring people. Nebula pulled the phone away from her ear. She opened the camera app. She turned off the flash, angled the lens to capture the harsh daylight, and took a picture of her face. The yellowing bruises, the cut on her temple, the swollen line of her jaw. She hit send. She put the phone back to her ear and waited. 10 seconds passed in silence. Then a sharp, ragged gasp echoed through the receiver. Did you get it? Nebula asked softly. Nebula! Chloe choked on a sob. Oh my God! Oh my God, Nebula, did he do that to you? Yes, Nebula said. He dragged me onto the patio at your reception and punched me in the face because he thought I looked at a bartender. If I had gotten in his car that night, Chloe, I don't think I would have survived the weekend. Chloe was openly weeping now, the sound raw and devastating. He was just here. He was sitting at our kitchen table drinking coffee. I hugged him. Don't tell him you spoke to me, Nebula warned, her eyes scanning the busy streets below. Don't tell Mom and Dad yet. He is losing control of the narrative, and he is going to get desperate. Just lock your doors. Are you safe? Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Richard said you were with a criminal, a monster. Nebula looked through the glass doors. Gilbert was standing in the living room, a gun disassembled on the oak table. He was cleaning the barrel with meticulous, terrifying precision. He looked up, his pale eyes finding hers through the glass. I am with a monster, Chloe. Nebula said, the wind carrying her words away. But he's my monster, and for the first time in 3 years, I'm perfectly safe. Cabin fever set in by day 6. The penthouse, for all its expansive views and tailored comfort, was still a gilded cage. Nebula needed to feel concrete under her feet. She needed to breathe air that hadn't been filtered through a luxury HVAC system. When she told Gilbert she wanted to walk down the street to a small, independent coffee shop, he didn't argue. He simply stood up, holstered a compact firearm at the small of his back, and slipped on his dark wool coat. I can go alone, Nebula said, though the thought made her pulse spike. No, you can't. Gilbert replied smoothly, holding the front door open. Not yet, but I won't crowd you. The crisp autumn air hit Nebula's face as they stepped out of the private elevator and onto the bustling sidewalk. The city was alive, indifferent to her trauma. Businessmen rushed past with briefcases. Tourists snapped photos of skyscrapers. It was violently normal. Gilbert walked a half-step behind her, a silent shadow. 2 of his men wearing plain clothes trailed 30 yards back, blending perfectly into the pedestrian traffic. They reached the coffee shop. Nebula ordered a latte, the mundane transaction feeling like a monumental victory. She carried the warm paper cup back out to the sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the exhaust-tinted air. "Better?" Gilbert asked, watching her face carefully. "Much," Nebula said, offering a small, genuine smile. The yellow bruise stretched tight, but it didn't hurt as much. They turned to walk back to the towering glass high-rise that housed Gilbert's corporate front and penthouse. "Nebula." The voice ripped through the ambient noise of the street like a gunshot. Nebula froze her blood, turning instantly to ice. The paper cup slipped from her fingers, splattering hot milk and espresso across the grey concrete. Richard stepped out from the narrow alleyway between a deli and a bank, blocking the sidewalk. He looked horrendous. The impeccably tailored architect was gone. His designer suit was violently wrinkled, stained with sweat, and God knew what else. His hair was greasy, hanging in his bloodshot eyes. A dark, jagged bruise marred his neck, the exact shape of Gilbert's thumb. Gilbert didn't hesitate. He stepped smoothly in front of Nebula, his body a solid wall of muscle shielding her from view. His right hand casually slipped beneath his wool coat, resting on the grip of his weapon. "You have exactly 3 seconds to step back into that alley, Trent," Gilbert said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It vibrated with a lethal promise. Richard ignored him, his manic eyes trying to peer around Gilbert's broad shoulders. "Nebula, Nebula, they took my firm. My accounts are frozen. The bank seized the house. This animal is destroying my life." 2. Gilbert counted, his pale eyes locked on Richard's chest. The 2 guards in plain clothes were closing the distance fast, their hands also slipping into their jackets. "You think you can just leave me?" Richard screamed, spit flying from his lips, his public mask completely shattered. Pedestrians on the sidewalk began to scatter, sensing the impending violence. "You think you can ruin me and walk away? I am your husband?" Richard lunged forward. It was a desperate, uncoordinated movement aimed blindly at Gilbert to get to Nebula. Gilbert's reaction was terrifyingly fast. He didn't draw his gun. He stepped into Richard's lunge, catching the man's outstretched wrist. Gilbert twisted sharply, stepping through the momentum. A sickening wet snap echoed over the sound of traffic. Richard let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, his knees buckling as his forearm bent at a horrific, unnatural angle. He collapsed onto the concrete, clutching his broken arm to his chest, sobbing hysterically. The 2 guards arrived, grabbing Richard by his collar and hauling him roughly to his feet, pinning his good arm behind his back. Gilbert adjusted his cuffs, his breathing completely even. He looked at the weeping man with total disgust. "I told you what would happen if you looked for her." "Call the police!" Richard wailed to the empty street, tears streaming down his face. "He broke my arm. Look at what he did." "I am the police in this district, Richard," Gilbert said coldly. "And right now you are trespassing." Nebula stepped out from behind Gilbert. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to stand tall. She looked at Richard. This was the man who had terrified her for 3 years. The man who had made her flinch at the sound of a closing door. The man who had convinced her she was worthless. Looking at him now, sobbing broken, pathetic on the dirty sidewalk, the fear evaporated. He wasn't a god. He was just a bully who relied on locked doors and dark rooms. Stripped of his money, his house, and his secrecy, he was nothing. "Nebula!" Richard gasped, his face pale with shock and pain. "Nebula, please. Look at what he's doing to me. Tell him to stop. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I hit you. I was just stressed. Please." Nebula stared at him, feeling the phantom ache in her jaw. "You aren't sorry you hit me?" "Richard," Nebula said, her voice remarkably steady. "You're just sorry he hit you back." She turned to Gilbert. "I'm ready to go home." Gilbert's eyes softened infinitely as he looked at her. He offered his arm. Nebula took it, letting his heat ground her. They walked away, leaving Richard screaming in the grip of the guards, his voice fading into the chaotic symphony of the city. As the elevator doors closed in the lobby, carrying them back up to the penthouse, Gilbert looked down at her. "He won't ever come near you again," Gilbert said. "My men are putting him on a freight train to the Midwest. If he comes back to this city, he won't leave it." Nebula leaned her head against Gilbert's shoulder. She was exhausted, but for the first time in years her mind was quiet. "Thank you," she whispered. Gilbert wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "I told you, Nebula. You're mine to protect. That hasn't changed. That will never change." Winter arrived with a brutal, biting frost that encased the city in grey ice. Frost crept up the edges of the floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the sprawling metropolis below. Inside the penthouse, the climate was carefully controlled, warm and quiet. Nebula's jaw had finally healed. The hideous yellow had faded into the natural porcelain of her skin. The physical damage was gone, but the psychological wreckage was still being sorted piece by piece, day by day. She spent her mornings reading on the velvet sofa, her afternoons walking the perimeter of the safe zones Gilbert had established for her. She had a driver now, a massive, silent man named David, who treated her like a fragile, priceless artifact. She had money. Gilbert had deposited an obscene amount into an account solely in her name, telling her it was back pay for the years she had wasted. She didn't spend it. She didn't need to. Gilbert worked late. He came home smelling of cold night air exhaust and the heavy burden of consequence. He never brought the violence through the front door. He left his weapons in the biometric safe in the foyer. He left his orders in the secured boardroom downtown. By the time he walked into the kitchen, unbuttoning his collar and rolling up his sleeves, he was just Gilbert. One evening in late December, Nebula sat cross-legged on the thick rug by the digital fireplace. She was reading a novel she couldn't focus on. Gilbert walked in his shoulders tight with exhaustion. He poured 2 glasses of amber bourbon, carrying them over to the fire. He handed her one, sitting on the edge of the coffee table, his knees inches from hers. "Rough day?" she asked, taking the glass. The heavy crystal felt grounding in her palm. "Port Authority disputes?" Gilbert murmured, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Bureaucrats who want a larger cut of a pie they didn't bake." "Tedious?" Nebula took a sip. The liquor burned a sharp, familiar heat. "You could walk away from it. You have enough money to buy an island, Gilbert. You don't have to fight bureaucrats." Gilbert looked at her. His pale eyes caught the flickering orange light of the fire. "I don't do this for the money, Nebula. I do this for the control. When you control the board, no one can move your pieces." He reached out his large hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before his knuckles brushed gently against her cheek, right where the bruise used to be. "When you control the board, people you care about don't get hurt." She leaned into his touch. It was an instinctive, subconscious movement, but it made Gilbert freeze. He let out a slow, measured breath, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I was so naive," Nebula whispered, closing her eyes against the warmth of his palm. 3 years ago I thought monsters only existed in dark alleys. I thought if a man wore a nice watch and spoke well, he was safe. I was arrogant enough to judge you for being honest about what you are. You were looking for peace." Gilbert corrected softly. "There is no sin in that." "I found it here," she said. She opened her eyes, meeting his steady gaze. "In a fortress paid for by extortion and violence, with a man who broke my husband's arm without blinking. That makes me just as bad, doesn't it?" Gilbert set his glass on the table. He slid off the edge, dropping to his knees on the rug right in front of her. He took her glass, setting it next to his, and took both of her hands in his. His grip was firm, anchoring her to the present. "It makes you awake." Gilbert said, his voice a low, rough rumble in the quiet room. "This world is entirely teeth, Nebula. You just finally stopped pretending it isn't. And as long as I have breath in my lungs, Nothing will ever sink its teeth into you again. He leaned forward, pressing his lips to her forehead. It wasn't a kiss of aggressive possession. It was a seal, a vow forged in the wreckage of her old life. Nebula exhaled, her shoulders dropping, the last lingering knot of tension dissolving into the quiet air. She buried her face in his neck, breathing in the scent of cedar and rain, finally completely at home. Coffee cups clattered against saucers in the private dining room of a Michelin-starred restaurant Gilbert owned in the French Quarter. The restaurant was officially closed to the public until dinner service, but the kitchen had prepared a lavish brunch spread solely for two women sitting at the corner booth. Nebula stirred her latte. Across the table, Chloe looked terrified. Her younger sister kept casting nervous glances at the two massive men standing by the double doors. They wore immaculate suits and earpieces, their eyes scanning the empty room with predatory vigilance. "They aren't going to hurt you, Chloe." Nebula said, her tone gentle but firm. "They are here to make sure no one else does." Chloe swallowed hard, wrapping both hands around her untouched mimosa. "Mom and Dad want to see you. They're confused. Richard just disappeared. His firm went bankrupt overnight. The house went into foreclosure. The police found his car abandoned at a train station. It's like he was erased." "He was," Nebula stated plainly. Chloe flinched. She looked at her older sister, really looking at her. Nebula was wearing a tailored charcoal blazer over a silk camisole. Her posture was straight, her chin tipped up. The haunted, fragile woman who had stood at the altar a month ago was completely gone. In her place sat someone utterly untouchable. "Did you do it?" Chloe whispered, leaning across the table, her voice trembling. Did Gilbert kill him?" "No," Nebula replied. She didn't offer a reassuring smile. She offered the cold, unvarnished truth. "Richard is alive. He is working at a lumberyard in South Dakota under an assumed name. He lives in a one-bedroom trailer, and he knows that if he ever tries to contact our family, or if he ever steps foot in this state again, he will not survive the trip." Chloe stared at her, horrified and fascinated all at once. "Nebula, you're talking like a mobster. I am talking like a woman who survived a coward." Nebula corrected, leaning back against the leather booth. "Richard beat me for 3 years, Chloe. Mom and Dad saw the bruises. You saw the bruises. Everyone bought his lies because it was easier than confronting the ugly truth. Gilbert didn't look away. Gilbert stopped it. If that makes him a criminal, then I will gladly stand beside a criminal." Tears welled in Chloe's eyes. She reached across the table, grabbing Nebula's hand. "I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have asked harder questions." Nebula squeezed her sister's hand. The anger she had held on to for the last month finally began to dissipate, floating away into the ambient noise of the city outside. "You couldn't have known. He was a master architect. He built beautiful facades. But I need you to understand something, Chloe. I am not coming back to the suburbs. I am not going to Sunday dinners to pretend everything is normal. This is my life now." Chloe looked at the armed guards, then back at Nebula's calm, resolute face. "Are you happy?" Nebula thought about the quiet mornings in the glass penthouse. She thought about the heavy, grounding weight of Gilbert's hand on her back. She thought about the absolute certainty that she would never, ever have to be afraid of the dark again. "I am safe," Nebula said softly. "And right now that is so much better than happy." Hours later, the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the city in shadows and gold. Nebula stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the freezing wind whipping her hair around her face. She leaned against the glass railing, watching the millions of lights flicker on in the grid below. Behind her, the heavy glass door slid open. Gilbert stepped out into the cold. He didn't wear a coat, just his dress shirt and slacks, indifferent to the biting wind. He stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and pulling her back flush against his broad chest. "How was the sister?" Gilbert murmured, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Terrified," Nebula admitted, resting her hands over his forearms. "But she understands. She knows I'm not coming back." Gilbert tightened his grip, a silent, possessive reassurance. "They will adjust. People always adapt to the new reality when they realize the old one is gone." Nebula leaned her head back against his shoulder, looking out at the sprawling, chaotic world Gilbert ruled. It was a dangerous, violent empire, but within its center, wrapped in the arms of the man who ran it, she was the safest woman alive. She tilted her head, pressing a kiss to the pulse point on his neck. "Thank you for coming to get me," she whispered into the cold night air. Gilbert turned her in his arms, his pale eyes entirely consumed by a dark, unwavering devotion. He framed her face with his large hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "I would have torn the world down to the bedrock to find you," Gilbert said, his voice a gravelly vow against her lips. "You just had to call," he kissed her, tasting of bourbon and survival. The city below them carried on ignebulant of the monsters and the broken things that found each other in the dark, building kingdoms out of concrete and bone. Did you love this dark, protective Mafia romance? If Nebula's journey from a broken, terrified wife to the untouchable queen of Gilbert's empire kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share this video with a friend who loves a morally grey hero who burns the world down for the woman he loves. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming gritty romance stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have made the same call Nebula did? Let us know.